A pregnant dog refuses to give birth, no matter how hard the vet tries to help her. Concerned, the vet performs an ultrasound, but what she sees makes her scream in horror. This isn't just a difficult pregnancy. Something inside this dog could change everything. What did the vet discover? And will she be able to save the mother and her unborn puppies before it's too late? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Dr. Lila Moore's blue Honda Civic rolled into town. Her tired eyes scanned the quiet square, taking in the weathered storefronts and handful of locals going about their business. A man swept the sidewalk outside the hardware store, while two elderly women chatted on a bench near a small fountain. Lila's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she pulled up to her new clinic. The single-story building needed a fresh coat of paint, but the large windows were clean, and the small garden out front showed signs of recent care. She sat in her car for a moment, her fingers absently touching the silver pendant hanging from her rearview mirror, David's last Christmas gift to her. "Well, this is it," she whispered to herself, grabbing her purse and the box of essential supplies from the passenger seat. The key stuck slightly in the lock, but with a firm twist, the door opened. The reception area smelled of old wood and cleaning supplies. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams streaming through the windows. Her footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor as she made her way to what would be her examination room. As Lila unpacked her medical equipment, memories of David flooded back. She could almost hear his excited voice as they'd planned their future together. "We'll have the most modern equipment," he'd said, his eyes sparkling. "No animal will be turned away." The bell above the front door chimed, startling her from her thoughts. "Hello? Anyone home?" called a cheerful voice. Lila wiped her eyes quickly and stepped into the reception area. A plump woman in a floral dress stood there, clutching her handbag with both hands. "I'm Mrs. Hargrove, dear. I live just down the street and saw your car pull up." She moved forward, extending her hand. "We're all so pleased to finally have a vet in town again." "Dr. Lila Moore," Lila replied, shaking the offered hand. "Nice to meet you." "Oh, you must be exhausted from your drive." Mrs. Hargrove settled herself onto one of the waiting room chairs without invitation. "Let me fill you in on everything you need to know about our little town." For the next 20 minutes, Mrs. Hargrove shared details about everyone from the mayor to the high school janitor. Lila half listened as she continued unpacking until one name caught her attention. "And then there's Joe out on the old Miller property," Mrs. Hargrove said, lowering her voice. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a soft spot for strays. Always taking in injured animals. Could probably use your help, though he's too proud to ask." When Mrs. Hargrove finally left, the sun was setting. Lila stood at the window, watching the sky turn pink and orange above the town's water tower. The clinic felt empty and a little lonely, but something about the quiet street and distant hills stirred a feeling of possibility in her chest. She unrolled her sleeping bag onto the cot she'd set up in her office, next to boxes still waiting to be unpacked. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, she just needed to rest. As she lay down, the last rays of sunlight painted the ceiling in warm gold, and for the first time in months, Lila felt like she might have made the right choice. The first rays of dawn were just breaking when Lila heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside the clinic. She sat up on her cot, still groggy from a restless night's sleep. Through the window, she saw an old blue pickup truck parking at an angle, its headlights cutting through the morning mist. A tall man in worn jeans and a flannel shirt stepped out, carefully cradling something in his arms. As he approached the clinic door, Lila could see it was a dog, thin and dirty, with a swollen belly. She hurried to unlock the door. "Can I help you?" "Name's Joe," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "This here's Rosie. She showed up at my farm a few weeks back, and I've been trying to care for her, but—" He looked down at the dog with worried eyes. "She ain't doing so good." Lila led them to the examination room, where Joe laid Rosie on the table with extreme care. The dog's ribs showed through her matted golden fur, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. "She won't eat much," Joe explained, keeping one hand on Rosie's head. "Just lies around most days. And yesterday, when my tractor backfired, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Never seen a dog so scared of noise." Lila approached slowly, letting Rosie smell her hand before beginning her examination. The dog's muscles tensed under her touch, but she didn't resist. As Lila parted Rosie's fur, she found a network of old scars across her back and sides. Some appeared to be from wire, others from what might have been cigarette burns. "Oh, sweetheart," Lila murmured, her heart aching. "Someone wasn't kind to you, were they?" Joe's weathered face darkened. "Figured as much. Way she acts like she's expecting to be hurt." Lila felt carefully around Rosie's swollen abdomen. "She's definitely pregnant and quite far along, but her stress levels and malnutrition could complicate things." She straightened up and looked at Joe. "I'd like to do an ultrasound tomorrow, after she's had a chance to settle in. We need to know how many puppies we're dealing with and if they're okay." "You want to keep her here?" Joe asked, concern evident in his voice. "Just for a few days to monitor her condition. I'll call you with updates, I promise." Lila saw the worry in his eyes. "You've grown attached to her, haven't you?" Joe nodded, running a gentle hand along Rosie's back. "She may be scared, but there's something special about her. Never met a sweeter dog once she trusts you." After Joe left, Lila prepared a recovery kennel, lining it with soft blankets and placing fresh water and food inside. She helped Rosie settle in, speaking softly and moving slowly to avoid startling her. That evening, as Lila prepared to close up the clinic, she paused by Rosie's kennel. The dog was watching her with deep brown eyes, a mix of fear and hope in her gaze that made Lila's chest tighten. It was a look that seemed to ask for help, for safety, for someone to finally be gentle with her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clinic floor as Lila prepared the ultrasound equipment. She moved deliberately, keeping her footsteps light to avoid startling Rosie. The quiet of the small-town clinic was a stark contrast to the constant buzz of her former city practice, where emergency cases and demanding pet owners had filled every moment. "Such a different pace here," she murmured, organizing her supplies. The silence was broken only by the gentle whir of the air conditioning and occasional bird songs drifting through the window. Amy, her young assistant, arrived just as Lila was getting ready to begin. Together, they carefully moved Rosie to the examination table, speaking in hushed tones and offering gentle reassurance. As Lila guided the ultrasound wand across Rosie's belly, her practiced eye caught something concerning. "There," she pointed to the screen. "See this puppy here? The skull doesn't look right." Amy leaned in closer. "What's wrong with it?" "Hydrocephalus. Fluid. Buildup in the brain." Lila's fingers traced the outline on the screen. "It can cause serious complications during birth. We might need to do a C-section." While examining Rosie's abdomen more closely, Lila's hand brushed against something that made her pause. "Amy, look at these scars." She parted Rosie's fur to reveal faint surgical marks. "These are from previous C-sections. Multiple ones, from the look of it." "Previous C-sections?" Amy's eyes widened. "But she's a stray." "I don't think she was always stray," Lila said grimly. "These marks are consistent with commercial breeding operations. Someone was using her repeatedly for puppies." Lila reached for the phone and dialed Joe's number. When he answered, she explained what they'd found, both the puppy's condition and the evidence of Rosie's past. "I'll come by this afternoon," Joe said, his voice tight with concern. "We need to figure out what's best for her." After hanging up, Lila retreated to her office. She pulled out her medical texts, spreading them across her desk as she searched for information about complicated canine pregnancies. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. Surrounded by open books and medical journals, Lila felt doubt creep in. This wasn't a routine case, and she was far from the advanced facilities and specialist colleagues she'd left behind. Her eyelids grew heavy as she pored over case studies, and eventually, her head came to rest on an open textbook, exhaustion finally overtaking her determination. The afternoon sun streamed through the clinic's small break room window as Joe set a thermos on the table in front of Lila. The rich aroma of coffee filled the air, making her stomach growl with a reminder of just how long she'd been working without a break. "When's the last time you ate?" Joe asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. His calloused fingers drummed lightly on the table as he waited for her answer. Lila wrapped her hands around the warm thermos, savoring the heat that seeped into her tired fingers. "Last night, I think. Maybe." She took a grateful sip, letting the bitter warmth chase away some of her exhaustion. "Thank you for this." Joe settled into the chair across from her, the old wooden seat creaking under his weight. "There's something else you should know about Rosie," he said, his voice low and troubled. "She's terrified of most men. Won't let them anywhere near her. Took me days just to get her to trust me, and I still have to move real slow around her." Lila nodded, making mental notes as her veterinary mind cataloged this new information. "That fits with what we found. I'd like to run some blood tests, check for other health issues we might have missed." She fought back a yawn, determined to stay focused on the task at hand. While they waited for the test results, Joe shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his work boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. "There's more," he said, his expression darkening. "Tommy Jensen, he lives down the road from me, mentioned something about strange noises coming from the old Miller property. Lots of dogs, he said. I should have looked into it sooner." "You couldn't have known," Lila assured him, though she could see the guilt weighing on him like a physical burden. His shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible load. The blood test results confirmed their fears, the numbers on the page telling a story of prolonged suffering. "She's severely malnourished," Lila explained, scanning the report with growing concern. "And these markers suggest internal scarring. This wasn't just neglect. This was systematic abuse." Her fingers tightened on the paper, crinkling its edges. Lila called the local animal control officer, explaining their concerns. The officer's response was cautious, almost hesitant. "Keep her safe," he advised. "We'll start looking into the Miller property, but these investigations take time." His words carried an unspoken warning about the delicacy of the situation. As the day drew to a close, Lila walked Joe to his truck. They stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of what they might uncover hanging between them like a heavy cloud. Joe's truck kicked up dust as he drove away, and Lila watched until his taillights disappeared around the bend, twin red stars fading into the gathering dusk. Before turning in for the night, she made one final check on Rosie. The dog lifted her head slightly as Lila approached the kennel, her dark eyes reflecting the dim light of the overnight lamps. "Nobody's going to hurt you again," Lila whispered, her hand resting gently on the kennel door. "I promise." The words felt like a sacred vow in the quiet of the darkening clinic. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Lila arrived at her clinic to find a cluster of people gathered outside. Their murmured conversations died down as she approached, keys jingling in her hand. She recognized several faces from around town, including Mrs. Hargrove, who stood wringing her hands nervously. "Is it true?" Mrs. Hargrove asked. "About that poor dog Joe found?" Before Lila could answer, a gruff voice cut through the crowd. "Sounds like a lot of fuss over nothing, if you ask me," said Tom Baker, the hardware store owner. "Strays are always getting into trouble." Lila unlocked the clinic door and turned to face the group. "Please, let me explain what we know." She invited a few of the more concerned locals inside, including Mrs. Hargrove and the Hendersons, an elderly couple who'd been vocal about their worry for Rosie. In the waiting room, Lila carefully outlined Rosie's condition, showing them the X-rays and test results. "These scars here," she pointed to the images, "suggest repeated surgical procedures, and her blood work indicates long-term malnutrition." The bell above the door chimed, and Mr. Phelps stepped in, his expensive boots clicking against the floor. The atmosphere in the room instantly changed, growing tense and uncomfortable. Joe, who had been quietly standing in the corner, straightened up. "Quite a story you're spinning, Dr. Moore," Phelps said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "But you know how these strays are, always getting themselves into trouble. Hardly evidence of anything sinister." From the back of the clinic, Rosie let out a low whine. Lila watched as the dog pressed herself against the back of her kennel, trembling at the sound of Phelps's voice. "I think it's best if you leave," Joe said firmly, stepping between Phelps and the hallway leading to the kennels. After Phelps departed, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence, Max and his grandparents entered the clinic. The 10-year-old boy hung back near the door, his eyes darting nervously toward the kennels. "We want to help," Max's grandmother said, placing a gentle hand on her grandson's shoulder. "Whatever you need." Max inched closer to the kennel area but stopped several feet away, watching Rosie with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The pregnant dog lay quietly in her kennel, her eyes following the boy's movements. That evening, Lila sat at her desk, organizing medical records and photographs into a neat file. She documented every scar, every abnormal test result, building a case that couldn't be ignored. Through the window, she could see the town's main street, quiet now as dusk settled. A few lights flickered on in shop windows, and she thought about the mixed reaction she'd face today, knowing that not everyone would support her efforts to uncover the truth. The early morning light had barely touched the clinic windows when Lila hurried through the door, responding to Amy's worried call. Inside, they found Rosie pacing restlessly in her kennel, her pregnant belly swaying with each anxious step. "She hasn't touched her food since last night," Amy said, pointing to the full bowl. "And she's been like this for hours." Lila crouched near the kennel, studying Rosie's rapid breathing and tense muscles. "We need to run a stress test. Her condition is getting worse." They carefully moved Rosie to the examination room, where Lila attached monitoring equipment to track her heart rate and blood pressure. The pregnant dog's eyes darted around the room, her anxiety evident in every movement. Halfway through the test, Rosie's legs buckled. She crashed to the floor with a whimper that made Lila's heart stop. "Amy, get me the emergency kit." Lila dropped to her knees beside Rosie, checking her vitals. "Stay with me, girl. Stay with me." They worked together, administering fluids and medication until Rosie's breathing steadied. The incident left them both shaken. "We can't wait any longer," Lila said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "The stress is too much for her." She called Joe, explaining the situation in a voice that trembled slightly. Within 20 minutes, he arrived at the clinic carrying a worn plaid blanket. "She used to sleep on this at the farm," he said softly, placing it near Rosie. The dog's nose twitched at the familiar scent. "I'm not leaving until she's okay." Lila watched as Joe sat on the floor next to Rosie's kennel, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. The scene struck something deep within her. Memories of long nights at her old clinic, her fiancé bringing her coffee and encouragement during difficult cases. Now here she was, fighting another battle, trying to save another life. Like Rosie, she too was learning to trust again, to move forward despite her scars. Later, after Joe's presence had helped calm Rosie, Lila stood alone in front of the ultrasound machine. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark screen, doubt clouding her features. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. Rosie's life, her puppies, the trust Joe had placed in her. She placed her hand on the machine, taking deep breaths to steady herself for what lay ahead. Officer Daniels arrived at the clinic just as Lila finished checking Rosie's vitals. His police uniform was crisp and freshly pressed, but the worry lines etched deeply around his eyes and mouth told their own story. The afternoon sun streaming through the window cast long shadows across the examination room. "Dr. Moore," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair, "I wanted to update you personally about the breeding operation investigation. I figured you'd want to hear this directly." Lila led him to her small office, where they could speak privately. The cramped space was filled with medical reference books and the faint scent of coffee from her morning cup. "Have you found anything?" she asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of her voice. "We've received several reports of neglected animals in the area," Daniel said, pulling out his well-worn notebook and flipping through the pages. "But nothing concrete enough for a warrant. These operations are good at covering their tracks. They know exactly how to stay just under the radar." Lila retrieved Rosie's medical file from her desk, the thick folder testament to the dog's troubled history. "I've documented everything I've found," she said, spreading out the photos of Rosie's scars and test results across her cluttered desk. "These surgical marks aren't from a licensed vet. They're crude and unprofessional, and her blood work shows chronic malnutrition. She's been through hell." Daniel studied the evidence carefully, his jaw tightening as he examined each photo. "This helps. It establishes a pattern of abuse. I'll add it to our investigation file. We're building something solid here." Joe, who had been helping clean kennels, joined them, the smell of disinfectant still clinging to his work clothes. "I can talk to some folks in town," he offered, leaning against the doorframe. "There are people who've seen things but been afraid to speak up. They trust me." "That could be risky," Daniels warned, his expression grave. "Phelps has friends in high places, people who owe him favors." "Someone has to stand up to him," Joe said firmly, crossing his arms over his chest. "We can't let fear keep winning." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Max and his grandparents. The boy clutched something in his hands as he peered into the office, his small face a mixture of uncertainty and determination. "Come on in, Max," Lila called warmly, her voice softening automatically. Max shuffled forward, revealing a small stuffed dog toy, worn but clean. He approached Rosie's kennel with slow, careful steps, his shoulders tense, but his chin held high. Everyone watched as he gently placed the toy on the floor near her, his hands trembling slightly. Rosie lifted her head from her bed, her nose twitching with interest. After a moment's hesitation, she stretched forward and nudged the toy with her nose, her tail giving the slightest wag. Max's face lit up with a tentative smile, his eyes sparkling with joy. "She likes it," he whispered, not taking his eyes off Rosie, his body relaxing inch by inch. Lila watched the interaction, feeling warmth spread through her chest like sunshine after rain. Here was Rosie, despite all her trauma, finding the courage to connect with this shy, fearful boy. And here was Max, overcoming his own fears to reach out to her. Their shared bravery touched something deep in her heart. The scene before her shifted something in Lila's perspective. This wasn't just about bringing criminals to justice or saving one dog. It was about healing. Every gentle touch, every moment of trust rebuilt something that had been broken, not just in Rosie, but in all of them. These small victories, she realized, were painting a larger picture of hope and redemption. The morning sun had barely risen when Lila began laying out surgical instruments on a steel tray. Her hands moved with practiced precision, though her heart raced with the weight of what lay ahead. Amy bustled around the operating room, checking monitors and preparing IV lines. "Everything needs to be perfect," Lila murmured, double-checking her surgery notes one more time. The clinic's front door chimed, and Joe's heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. His face was etched with concern as he appeared in the doorway. "Doc, we might have trouble," he said, his voice low. "Saw some trucks I didn't recognize last night, parked near Phelps' property. A lot of activity for that time of night." Lila set down her notes, her stomach tightening. "Joe, please be careful. If Phelps suspects we're on to him, he might try to move evidence. Or worse." She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let Officer Daniels handle the investigation. Just keep your eyes open and pass along what you see." Joe nodded reluctantly, his weathered hands clenching at his sides. "I just hate sitting back while—" A sharp whine from Rosie's kennel cut him off. Lila rushed to check on her patient, with Amy close behind. Rosie lay on her side, panting heavily, her belly contracting visibly. "She's going into labor," Lila announced, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "We need to operate now. Amy, prepare the anesthesia. Joe, I need you to wait outside." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. They carefully moved Rosie to the operating table, monitoring her vital signs as Amy prepared the anesthesia. Lila could see Amy's hands shaking as she reached for the dosage controls. "Wait," Lila called out, catching Amy's wrist just in time. "That's too much. She's already weak. We need to be precise." Amy's face paled. "I'm sorry, I've never assisted with something this critical before." "Hey, look at me," Lila said firmly but kindly. "You can do this. Rosie needs both of us to be focused. Take a deep breath and let's start again." Amy nodded, her hand steadier as she adjusted the anesthesia to the correct dose. Together, they prepared Rosie for surgery, the monitors beeping steadily in the background. Lila made the first incision, her movements careful and deliberate. Minutes that felt like hours passed as she worked to reach the puppies. Finally, she glimpsed the first one. "Almost there," she murmured, gently maneuvering to free the tiny creature. But when she lifted the puppy out, it was limp and silent in her hands. "No, no, no," Lila whispered, quickly moving to the resuscitation station. Her hands trembled slightly as she began chest compressions on the tiny body, willing it to take its first breath. Lila's fingers moved rhythmically over the tiny puppy's chest, performing careful compressions while Amy monitored the clock. The silence in the operating room was deafening, broken only by the steady beep of Rosie's heart monitor and Lila's focused breathing. Outside in the hallway, Joe paced back and forth, his boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. Each time he passed the operating room door, he strained to hear any signs of progress. His weathered face creased with worry. "Come on, little one," Lila whispered, continuing the compressions. Suddenly, the puppy twitched and let out a tiny gasp. Within seconds, its chest began to rise and fall with regular breaths. "We've got a heartbeat," Amy exclaimed, her eyes bright with relief. But Lila's celebration was short-lived. As she returned to continue the surgery, she discovered the hydrocephalic puppy wedged awkwardly in the birth canal. Its enlarged head made normal delivery impossible, and its position blocked access to the remaining puppies. "Amy, I need your help," Lila said, her voice calm but urgent. "We have to reposition this one before we can reach the others." Amy's hands hovered uncertainly over the surgical site. I don't want to hurt them." "You won't," Lila assured her. "Just follow my instructions exactly. Place your hand here, gentle pressure, that's it. Now help me guide it while I create more space." Together, they worked to carefully maneuver the stuck puppy. Just as they made progress, the monitors began blaring. Rosie's heart rate plummeted dangerously low. "She's crashing!" Amy's voice cracked with panic. Lila immediately shifted her focus to Rosie, her mind racing through emergency protocols. She administered medication through the IV while continuing to monitor the puppies. "Start chest compressions, Amy. Count them out loud." The next few minutes were intense as they fought to stabilize Rosie. Amy counted steadily, her voice growing stronger with each number, while Lila worked to regulate Rosie's heartbeat. Gradually, the monitor's beeping returned to a normal rhythm. With Rosie stable again, Lila returned to the delicate task of delivering the remaining puppies. One by one, she freed them from the birth canal, each one crying out with healthy lungs. The hydrocephalic puppy, though smaller than its siblings, survived the delivery. Hours after they had started, Lila placed the last puppy in the warming box. Her surgical gown was damp with sweat, and her back ached from standing, but a smile spread across her face as she watched Rosie beginning to stir from the anesthesia. Carefully, she moved the puppies next to their mother. Rosie's tail wagged weakly as she sensed her babies nearby. "You did it, girl," Lila whispered, gently stroking Rosie's head. The morning sun filtered through the clinic's windows as Lila checked Rosie's vitals. The mother dog lay on her side, weakly but persistently licking each of her puppies as they squirmed beside her. Amy adjusted the heating lamp while Joe sat nearby, speaking softly to Rosie. "That's it, girl. You're doing great," Joe murmured as one of the puppies latched on to Nurse. The clinic's bell chimed throughout the morning as locals arrived bearing gifts. Mrs. Henderson brought fresh blankets, while Mr. Tucker from the hardware store delivered puppy formula and bottles. Each visitor crowded around the viewing window, their faces lighting up at the sight of the tiny family. Max arrived with his grandparents around noon, clutching something in his hands. His eyes were wide with wonder as he approached the window. "I made this," he said softly, holding up a small stuffed toy made from old socks. "It's for the special puppy." Lila smiled and invited them in, explaining the proper sanitization procedures. As Max placed his gift near the hydrocephalic puppy, Lila gently explained to the gathered visitors about the dangers these animals faced. "Rosie came from a place where dogs are treated like machines," she explained, watching their faces grow serious. "Illegal breeding operations cause immense suffering. These animals deserve better." Officer Daniels arrived in the afternoon, his expression grim but determined. He pulled Lila aside while Amy supervised the visitors. "We found abandoned breeding equipment near Phelps' property," he said quietly. "Cages, medical supplies, the works. But it's not enough for a warrant yet. We need more concrete evidence linking him to Rosie." Later that afternoon, Joe returned to the clinic visibly agitated. His hands were clenched into fists and his face was flushed. "I ran into Phelps at the hardware store," he explained to Lila. "He had the nerve to ask about Rosie, acting all concerned. When I called him out on his operation, he threatened to sue for slander." "Joe, we have to be careful," Lila warned. "We need to let Officer Daniels handle this legally." "I know," Joe sighed, his anger giving way to determination. "But I won't let him hurt any more animals. We're going to shut him down one way or another." As evening approached, Lila stood in the recovery room, watching the puppy's nurse. Rosie's tail wagged gently when she noticed Lila's presence. The sight of the mother dog caring for her babies, despite everything she'd been through, filled Lila with hope. Perhaps this small town could come together to fight for what was right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clinic's front steps as Lila stepped out to bring in the newspaper. Her heart skipped a beat when she noticed a piece of paper taped to the glass door. The message, written in bold black letters, sent a chill down her spine. Stay out of things that don't concern you. Her fingers brushed against the paper, feeling the rough texture of cheap printer stock, and she noticed smudges around the edges where someone had handled it with sweaty hands. Her hands trembled as she dialed Officer Daniel's number, nearly dropping the phone twice. Within minutes, he arrived at the clinic, his patrol car's tires crunching on the gravel. He carefully removed the note and placed it in an evidence bag, handling it with latex gloves to preserve any fingerprints. "This has Phelps's people written all over it," Daniel said, frowning as he held the bag up to the light. "But proving it will be tough. They're usually careful about not leaving traces." Joe arrived shortly after, his weathered face creasing with concern, when he heard about the threat. His jaw clenched tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "I've got some security cameras from my barn. I'll install them today. No arguments." His tone left no room for discussion. Amy hovered nearby, wringing her hands, her face pinched with worry. "Lila, you shouldn't stay here alone. My spare room's all yours until this blows over." She nervously adjusted her sweater, a habit she had when stressed. Max and his grandparents arrived for their daily visit, the boy catching the tail end of the conversation. His small face paled, freckles standing out against his skin. "Are the dogs going to be okay?" he asked, clutching his sketchbook to his chest, his knuckles white against the spiral binding. Lila knelt down to his eye level, forcing a reassuring smile. "Everyone's safe, Max. We're just being extra careful." She gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. Max nodded solemnly and made his way to the recovery room. He sat cross-legged by the window, watching the hydrocephalic puppy crawl around on wobbly legs. "I think we should call her Hope," he announced softly, opening his sketchbook to a fresh page. "Because she's brave, like Rosie." As evening settled over the town, painting the sky in deep purples and blues, Joe's truck idled outside the clinic while he finished mounting the last security camera. His attention was drawn to an unfamiliar sedan parked across the street, its engine running with a low purr. When he started walking toward it, his boots heavy on the pavement, the car's tires squealed against the pavement as it sped away into the darkness, leaving behind the acrid smell of burning rubber. "Did you get the license plate?" Lila asked from the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the evening chill. Joe shook his head, squinting into the darkness. "Too dark. But I'll recognize that car if I see it again. Dark blue Chrysler, probably early 2000s model." Later that night, Lila stood at the clinic's entrance, key in hand. The street lights cast eerie shadows on the empty sidewalk, and every rustle of leaves made her jump. A cat yowled somewhere in the distance, making her heart race. She turned the key twice in the lock, testing the handle with 3 sharp tugs. Inside, she made one final check on Rosie and her puppies. The mother dog lifted her head, watching Lila with trusting brown eyes. Hope and her siblings were curled up against their mother's belly, sleeping peacefully, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. Lila's footsteps echoed in the quiet clinic as she did one last round, checking every window and door before heading to her office for the night. The security camera's red lights blinked steadily in the darkness, offering a small measure of comfort. Officer Daniels spread a map across his desk, carefully marking the locations of recent suspicious activities with red pins. The pattern was becoming clearer with each new incident. Lila and Joe sat across from him in the cramped office, their faces tight with concern as they detailed the threatening note and the mysterious car that had been lurking around the clinic. "I'll have patrols drive by the clinic more frequently," Daniel said, making detailed notes in his worn leather notebook, the pages crinkled from constant use. "And we'll set up surveillance near Phelps's property. But remember, document everything. Even the smallest detail could be important. Take photos if you can, but stay safe." Back at the clinic, Lila immersed herself in research, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Her computer screen flickered with reports and statistics about illegal breeding operations across the country. Each article made her stomach turn. Horrifying stories of neglect, abuse, and the devastating impact on innocent animals. She printed the most relevant information, organizing everything into a thick folder of evidence that might help build their case against Phelps. "This has to stop," she whispered to herself, running her fingers through her tangled hair. The weight of what they were up against pressed heavily on her shoulders. That afternoon, Joe burst through the clinic door, slightly out of breath, his boots leaving muddy prints on the floor. "My neighbor Tom finally talked," he said, pulling up a chair that creaked under his weight. "Says he's seen trucks moving dogs in cages near Phelps' property. Always late at night, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. Says he's heard awful sounds coming from that direction, too." Lila immediately called Daniels to relay this new information, her hands shaking slightly with anticipation. As she hung up, Max appeared in the doorway with his grandparents, clutching his well-worn sketchbook as usual, his eyes bright with excitement. He made his way to Rosie's kennel, where she lay nursing her puppies, her gentle eyes watching him approach. Hope wobbled over to the gate on unsteady legs, wagging her tiny tail in greeting. Max sat cross-legged on the floor, watching them intently, his fear slowly melting away. Then, gathering his courage, he slowly reached out his hand. "That's it, Max," Lila encouraged softly, watching as his small fingers made contact with Rosie's soft fur. "Nice and gentle. You're doing great." Rosie lifted her head, giving Max's hand a gentle lick that made him giggle. His face broke into a wide smile. The first real smile Lila had seen from him since he started visiting. "She's so soft," he whispered in wonder, his voice filled with awe. The peaceful moment was interrupted hours later when darkness had settled over the town like a heavy blanket. Lila's phone rang sharply, Joe's name flashing on the screen, making her jump. "Something's happening near my farm," he said, his voice urgent and low. "I can hear dogs barking, lots of them, and there are vehicles moving around with their lights off. I think they're up to something big tonight." Lila grabbed her coat and keys, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I'm on my way, Joe. Don't do anything until I get there, and call Daniels. He needs to know about this." The gravel crunched under Lila's tires as she pulled up to Joe's farmhouse. Her headlights caught his figure standing at the property line, one hand raised in greeting, the other holding a powerful flashlight. The night air carried a bitter chill, and somewhere in the darkness, dogs were barking. "Over there," Joe whispered, pointing his beam toward a dense patch of woods. "The sounds are coming from that direction. Been getting louder for the past hour." They moved carefully through the undergrowth, branches crackling beneath their feet. Joe led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, while Lila followed close behind, her heart thundering in her chest. The barking grew louder, then suddenly stopped. After several minutes of careful navigation, they came upon a dilapidated shed. Its wooden walls were weathered gray, and the roof sagged dangerously in the middle. Joe tested the door. It wasn't locked. Inside, the beam of their flashlights revealed a grotesque scene. Empty metal cages lined the walls, their bars rusted and bent. Blood-stained towels lay scattered across a folding table, and various breeding equipment, syringes, medical supplies, and worn leather restraints cluttered the floor. "Look at this," Lila whispered, pointing to fresh scratches on the concrete floor. "These are recent." Joe pulled out his phone and started taking photos, careful to capture every detail. "We need to document everything," he said, his voice tight with anger. The flash from his phone illuminated dark stains on the walls and floor that made Lila's stomach turn. As they finished cataloging the evidence, a cool breeze carried the distant sound of an engine. They quickly stepped outside, where Joe's flashlight caught fresh tire tracks in the mud, leading away from the shed. "These weren't here when we came in," Joe said, quickly photographing them. "Must be from those trucks I saw earlier. They're moving the operation." The walk back to Joe's farm was tense and silent. Once they reached their vehicles, Lila checked her watch. It was well past midnight. "I need to get back to the clinic," she said, her voice hoarse. "Rosie and the puppies." When she returned to the clinic, Lila rushed to check on her patients. Rosie lifted her head as Lila approached, her tail wagging softly. The puppies were nestled against their mother, including little Hope, all sleeping peacefully. Sitting at her desk, Lila opened her laptop and began composing an email to Officer Daniels. She attached Joe's photos and detailed everything they discovered at the shed. Her eyes grew heavy as she typed, and eventually she drifted off to sleep right there in her office chair, her hands still resting on the keyboard. The morning sun filtered through the clinic windows as Officer Daniels studied the photos on Lila's desk. His weathered face creased with concern as he flipped through each image of the abandoned shed. "This definitely warrants investigation," he said, setting the photos down. "But I have to be honest with you. Without direct evidence linking Phelps to that shed, our case is shaky at best." Lila slumped in her chair. "But the equipment, the bloodstains, surely that counts for something." "It does," Daniels nodded. "But we need more. Right now, it's all circumstantial." Later that afternoon, Joe stopped by with a suggestion. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning against the reception desk. "Maybe we should reach out to some animal rescue groups, get more eyes on this situation." While they discussed possibilities, Max sat cross-legged on the floor near Rosie's kennel, carefully feeding Hope with a small bottle. The puppy's tail wagged as she drank, and Max smiled, something that happened more often now that he'd overcome his fear of dogs. "You're doing great, Max," Lila encouraged, watching him handle the puppy with growing confidence. That evening at the town council meeting, tension filled the air as Phelps confronted Joe in front of the gathered crowd. "You've been spreading lies about me," Phelps snarled, jabbing a finger at Joe's chest, "and trespassing on private property." Joe's face reddened. "The only liar here is you, Phelps, and I'm going to prove it." The argument escalated until Joe stormed out, slamming the door behind him. "Mark my words," he shouted over his shoulder, "the truth will come out." Later that night, the clinic plunged into darkness as the power suddenly cut out. Lila's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone's flashlight. The backup generator hummed to life, but the incident left her rattled. She stayed late, checking and rechecking the locks, making sure Rosie and the puppies were comfortable. Sitting at her desk, exhausted, she wondered if she was fighting a losing battle. The threats, the intimidation, the constant worry, was it worth it? Her eyes fell on the framed photo of her fiancé on her desk. His warm smile, captured mid-laugh during a hike they'd taken together, seemed to give her strength. She picked up the frame, running her finger along its edge. "You never backed down from doing what was right," she whispered, remembering his unwavering determination to help others. Drawing a deep breath, Lila set the photo down. She knew in her heart that she had to continue the fight, regardless of the consequences. Max burst through the clinic door early that morning, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders as his grandparents followed behind with amused smiles. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he approached Lila's desk, nearly tripping over his untied shoelaces in his rush. "Dr. Moore, can I adopt Hope? Please?" He bounced on his toes, barely containing his enthusiasm, his hands clasped together in front of his chest. I've been practicing with the bottle feeding, and I'm really good at it now. I even made a special corner in my room for her. Lila's heart warmed at his eagerness, but concern creased her brow as she shuffled the papers on her desk. Max, Hope's condition will need extra special care. She'll need regular checkups and possibly more medical attention as she grows. It's a big responsibility. I'll do anything, Max promised solemnly, standing straighter and squaring his small shoulders. I'll learn everything I need to know. I've been reading books about puppies from the library. Let's wait until she's a bit older, Lila suggested gently, reaching out to pat his hand. We'll see how she develops, okay? You can keep helping me care for her in the meantime. Later that morning, Joe rushed into the clinic, his face flushed with urgency and his work boots leaving muddy prints on the floor. Just got a call from Tom Baker, he said in a low voice, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Says he saw dogs being loaded into a truck near Phelps's property last night. Big white van, no markings. Lila immediately called Officer Daniels, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed. He listened intently before saying he'd gather a team to investigate the site, his voice grave with concern. While waiting for news from Daniels, Lila noticed Rosie's distress during feeding time. The mother dog paced anxiously in her kennel, her nails clicking against the floor as she struggled to settle down and nurse her puppies, her ears pinned back with worry. The stress is affecting her milk production, Lila explained to Max, who had stayed to help, his homework spread out on a nearby chair. We'll need to bottle feed the weaker ones, especially Hope. Her siblings are stronger and can get more milk when nursing. Max's face lit up at the chance to help, his earlier disappointment forgotten. Lila showed him how to hold the tiny puppy just right, demonstrating the proper feeding technique with gentle hands. Hope suckled eagerly from the bottle in Max's careful hands, her tiny paws kneading the air. That afternoon, Amy discovered another note taped to the clinic's back door, partially dampened by the morning's drizzle. Her hands shook as she handed it to Lila. The message was clear, written in thick black marker. Stay out of my business, or else. Layla added it to her growing file of evidence, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach and the slight tremor in her fingers. As night fell, Lila made her final rounds through the darkened clinic, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. She checked every lock, tested every window, and finally stopped at Rosie's kennel. The mother dog lifted her head from her sleeping puppies, warm brown eyes meeting Lila's with quiet trust. We'll get through this, Lila whispered, reaching through the bars to stroke Rosie's soft head, feeling the slight bump of an old scar beneath her fingers. The dog leaned into her touch, offering a quiet moment of connection in the growing darkness. A sudden knock at the door made Lila jump, her heart leaping into her throat. The sharp knock made Lila's heart race until she recognized Officer Daniels' familiar silhouette through the frosted glass. She quickly opened the door, relief washing over her face. Evening, Dr. Moore, Daniels said in a hushed tone, stepping inside. We're moving forward with the raid tomorrow night. I wanted to give you a heads up personally. His expression grew serious. But you need to be extra careful. Word's getting around town and some folks aren't happy about the investigation. The next morning, Lila threw herself into her work, trying to keep her mind off the upcoming raid. She lined up tiny syringes filled with vaccines and prepared for the puppy's health checks. Rosie watched from her kennel, more relaxed than she'd been in days. Max arrived after school, his face lighting up when he saw Hope wiggling in her basket. Can I feed her now, Dr. Moore? He asked, already reaching for the bottle he'd helped prepare earlier. Go ahead, Lila smiled, watching as he cradled the tiny puppy with growing confidence. You're becoming quite the expert, Max. Hope really responds to you. Joe stopped by mid-afternoon, his weathered hands fidgeting with his cap. "You think this raid will work?" he asked quietly. "What if Phelps finds a way to slip through again?" "We have to trust Officer Daniels," Lila assured him, though her own stomach churned with worry. "He knows what he's doing." As evening approached, Joe positioned himself near Phelps' property, keeping watch from a safe distance. He texted updates to Lila as Daniels and his team moved in. The raid revealed exactly what they'd feared: neglected dogs in poor condition, stacks of breeding documentation, and equipment matching what they'd found in the abandoned shed. But Phelps had an answer for everything. He produced lease documents showing the property had been rented out, claiming no knowledge of the illegal operation. The team confiscated the evidence and rescued the dogs. But without a direct connection to Phelps, they couldn't make an immediate arrest. Joe returned to the clinic, his face tight with frustration as he shared the news. "They got the dogs out at least," he said, running a hand through his gray hair. "But Phelps, he's slippery as an eel." As Lila began her closing routine, her phone rang. It was Officer Daniels. "The raid didn't give us everything we wanted," he admitted, "but we've got solid evidence now. It might take time, but we're building a case that could shut him down for good." Lila hung up and walked over to Rosie's kennel. The mother dog lay contentedly with her puppies, including Little Hope, all of them safe and growing stronger each day. Looking at them, Lila silently promised she wouldn't give up the fight. The morning sun filtered through the clinic windows as Lila arrived, surprised to find Max already waiting at the door. His backpack was stuffed with homework he'd promised his grandparents to complete between helping with the puppies. The cool morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass from the neighboring fields. "I wanted to be here for their breakfast," Max explained, his eyes bright with enthusiasm, bouncing slightly on his toes. "I even set 2 alarms to make sure I wouldn't oversleep." It warmed Lila's heart to see how different he was from the timid boy who'd first visited the clinic, barely able to look at a dog without flinching. Inside, Rosie greeted them with a gentle wag of her tail, her soft brown eyes following them across the room. The change in her was remarkable, too. She now welcomed visitors instead of cowering in the corner, her trust growing stronger each day. As Max carefully prepared the bottles under Lila's guidance, she noticed his steady hands and confident movements, so different from his earlier nervous fumbling. "See how Hope likes to be held at this angle?" Lila demonstrated, showing Max how to position the tiny puppy against his chest. "It helps her drink more easily. You want her to feel secure, just like her mama would hold her." Max nodded seriously, absorbing every detail like a tiny scientist. "Like this?" He adjusted his hold, beaming when Hope began to drink enthusiastically, her tiny paws kneading the air contentedly. The clinic door chimed, and Joe entered, his face drawn with worry, his usual warm smile absent. He waited until Max was absorbed in feeding Hope before pulling Lila aside, his weathered hands twisting his cap nervously. "Phelps cornered me at the feed store," he said quietly, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Made some threats about what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong. Said he knows people who can make life difficult." Despite his obvious concern, Joe's jaw was set with determination. "I told him I'm not backing down, not after what he did to these dogs." Lila squeezed his arm supportively, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Neither am I." She walked to her desk and pulled up her laptop, her fingers hovering determinedly over the keyboard. "I'm contacting the Regional Animal Advocacy Network. They need to know what's happening here. Maybe they can help put pressure on local authorities to take this seriously." She spent the next hour drafting a detailed email, describing the raid findings and the pattern of abuse they'd uncovered. Her fingers flew across the keys as she included photos of Rosie's scars and documentation of her injuries, careful to protect any confidential investigation details. Each word felt like another step toward justice. As evening approached, golden light painting shadows across the floor, the clinic settled into its usual peaceful rhythm. Max sat cross-legged on the floor, Hope cradled in his lap. Her tiny black and white form curled trustingly against him. His voice was soft as he read to her from his science textbook, occasionally pausing to stroke her ears. "And that's how butterflies transform," he explained to the drowsy puppy, who blinked at him with heavy eyes. "Kinda like how you're getting stronger every day. Soon you'll be running around just like your brothers and sisters." Lila paused in her work, watching the tender scene through misty eyes. The boy who once trembled at the sight of dogs was now a gentle, confident caregiver, a transformation as remarkable as any butterfly's. She turned back to her computer, adding a final paragraph to her statement about the transformative power of compassion in the face of cruelty, inspired by the sight of Max and Hope growing stronger together. The early morning silence was broken by the sharp ring of Lila's phone. Officer Daniel's voice carried a note of concern as he explained how Phelps was pushing back against the advocacy group's statement. "He's calling it a witch hunt," Daniel said. "Says you're just city folks who don't understand how things work around here." Throughout the morning, a steady stream of locals filtered into the clinic, their faces tight with disapproval. Mrs. Henderson, who had been bringing her cats to the clinic since Lila arrived, stood stiffly at the front desk. "I've known Thomas Phelps for 20 years, she said, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He's always supported our community events. I just don't think I can trust someone who'd make such accusations." She gathered her cat carrier and headed for the door. "I'll be taking Mittens to Dr. Roberts in the next town over." At the town diner, Joe sat at his usual corner booth trying to reason with his longtime friends. "You've all seen those trucks coming and going at odd hours," he insisted, his coffee growing cold. "You know something's not right there." Some nodded hesitantly, while others turned away. Tom Wheeler, who'd farmed alongside Joe for decades, shook his head. "Maybe you should mind your own business, Joe. Some things are better left alone." Joe's frustration bubbled over. Since when did standing up for what's right become minding our own business? He pushed away from the table, leaving his breakfast half-eaten. At home that evening, Max sat at his desk, listening to his grandparents discuss the situation in hushed tones in the kitchen. "Poor Dr. Moore," his grandmother sighed. "All this backlash might drive her away. Such a shame. She's been so good for the town." Max looked at Hope's picture on his desk, remembering how scared he used to be of dogs. With determination, he pulled out his notebook and began to write. "Dear Dr. Moore, I know some people are being mean about you helping Rosie, but I want you to know you're doing the right thing. Before I met you and Hope, I was afraid of all dogs. Now I know that being brave means standing up for others who need help, even when it's hard. Hope is getting stronger every day because you didn't give up on her. Please don't give up now. You're my hero, and I want to be a vet just like you someday. Thank you for everything, Max." That night, Lila sat alone in her office, Max's letter trembling in her hands. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she read his words again. She glanced at Rosie, peacefully nursing her puppies in the recovery area, then back at the letter. Wiping her eyes, she carefully placed the paper on her desk, right next to her computer, where she could see it every day. The morning sun cast long shadows across broken glass scattered on the clinic's floor. Lila stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding as she stared at the rock and crumpled note lying amid the shards. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper and read the threatening message. "Stop now, or it gets worse." Officer Daniels arrived within minutes of her call, his face grim as he photographed the damage. "I'll have patrol cars drive by more frequently," he assured her. "But please be careful, Dr. Moore. These people are getting desperate." Joe's truck screeched into the parking lot shortly after. His weathered face darkened at the sight of the broken window. "That's it," he declared, already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling my buddy who installs security systems. We'll have cameras up by tonight." Inside the recovery area, Rosie paced her kennel, whining softly. Her brown eyes followed Lila's every movement, ears flat against her head. Lila knelt beside the kennel, speaking in soothing tones. "It's okay, girl," she whispered, reaching through the bars to stroke Rosie's soft fur. "We're safe here." The dog pressed against her hand, and Lila felt some of her own tension ease. The bell above the door chimed, and Max burst in, his face flushed from running. "Dr. Moore," he called out, slightly out of breath. "I heard what happened. I came to help protect Rosie and Hope." Lila's heart melted at his determined expression. "That's very brave of you, Max," she said gently. "But everything's going to be fine. Officer Daniels and Joe are helping keep us safe." Joe returned from making his calls, his expression lighter. "The advocacy group's petition is picking up steam," he announced, showing Lila his phone screen. "Over 500 signatures already, and it's only been up for an hour. People are starting to pay attention." As evening approached, Lila methodically checked every lock and window. The temporary board covering the broken window cast strange shadows in the dimming light. She made her way to Rosie's kennel and settled on the floor beside it. Rosie immediately shifted closer, resting her head near Lila's hand. "We've come too far to give up now," Lila murmured, running her fingers through Rosie's soft fur. The steady rhythm of the dog's breathing helped calm her racing thoughts. Together, they sat in the quiet clinic, finding strength in each other's presence. Officer Daniels arrived at the clinic just as the sun was rising, his usually calm demeanor charged with nervous energy. Lila had barely unlocked the front door when he hurried inside. "We've got something," he said, his voice low but excited. "One of Phelps's workers came forward last night. They're ready to testify about everything." Lila's hands trembled as she set down her coffee. "Everything?" Daniels nodded, pulling out his notebook. "Financial records, breeding schedules, photos, it's all there. The worker documented years of abuse and illegal practices." But his expression sobered quickly. "Phelps's lawyers are already moving to discredit the witness and suppress the evidence. They're claiming the documents were obtained illegally." Joe arrived shortly after, his truck kicking up dust in the parking lot. When Daniels shared the news, Joe's face set with determination. "This is our chance," he said. "I'm calling a town meeting. We need to show everyone what's really happening." He turned to Lila. "Would you speak at the meeting? Tell them about Rosie, what you've seen. People trust you, Lila. They'll listen." Lila's stomach churned at the thought of public speaking, but one look at Rosie's kennel strengthened her resolve. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'll do it." Max arrived later that morning with his sketchbook clutched to his chest. "Dr. Moore," he called out, "I want to help too." He showed her his drawings, careful sketches of Rosie and Hope, each one capturing their gentle spirits. "Could we put these up at the meeting?" he asked hopefully, "so people can see how special they are?" Lila felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked at the drawings. "They're perfect, Max. Thank you." That evening, after the clinic had quieted down, Lila sat at her desk working on her speech. She wrote about finding Rosie, about the surgery, about the evidence of abuse. But mostly she wrote about hope, the kind she'd seen in Max's eyes when he overcame his fear of dogs, the kind she'd witnessed in Rosie's determination to survive. In the recovery room, Rosie lay curled around her puppies, all of them sleeping peacefully. Hope's tiny chest rose and fell steadily, her head resting on her mother's paw. Lila knelt beside them, her speech clutched in her hand. Tomorrow, she whispered to Rosie, we make them listen. The town hall buzzed with tension as people filed into the cramped space. Lila sat rigid in her front row seat, her speech clutched tightly in her hands. Next to her, Joe kept checking his watch while Max fidgeted between his grandparents, his folder of drawings balanced carefully on his lap. The door swung open, and Phelps strode in with his lawyer, both men wearing expensive suits that stood out among the casual attire of the townspeople. They took seats on the opposite side of the room, Phelps' face set in a confident smirk. Joe approached the podium first, his weathered hands gripping its edges. Many of you know me, he began, his voice steady. What you might not know is what we found in that abandoned shed near my property. He described the blood-stained towels, the cages, the evidence of suffering. When he held up the petition, now bearing hundreds of signatures, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lila's legs felt like jelly as she took Joe's place at the podium. Her first words came out soft and shaky, but as she spoke about Rosie, her voice found its strength. She described the scars that mapped the dog's abuse, the complications of her pregnancy, and the special needs of Hope, the puppy who refused to give up. These animals can't speak for themselves, she said, gesturing to Mac's drawings displayed on easels beside her. But their injuries, their fear, it all tells a story. Objection! Phelps' lawyer shot to his feet. These accusations are completely unfounded. My client... Your client has been running an illegal operation for years, Officer Daniels cut in, stepping forward with a folder. And we have proof. He introduced the former worker's testimony, reading excerpts that detailed breeding schedules and abuse. The room erupted. Those animals were treated fine, someone shouted from Phelps' side. You're trying to destroy a legitimate business. Legitimate? A woman stood up, her face red with anger. Is that what you call torture? Arguments broke out across the room. Some residents defended Phelps, citing his contributions to the local economy. Others rallied behind Lila and Joe, demanding justice for the animals. The town council chairman banged his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. We will review all evidence and the petition, he announced firmly. This meeting is adjourned. Lila stepped into the cool evening air outside the town hall, her body heavy with exhaustion. Joe appeared beside her, his face lined with concern, but determined. We made progress today, he said quietly. They have to listen now. The morning sun filtered through the clinic's windows as Lila unlocked the front door. She blinked in surprise at the small crowd already gathered outside. Mrs. Henderson clutched her elderly poodle, while the Baker family waited with their 2 cats. One by one, they filed in, each expressing support for her stand at the town meeting. We believe you, Dr. Moore, Mrs. Henderson said firmly, setting her poodle on the examination table. It's about time someone stood up to Phelps. By mid-morning, the waiting room buzzed with activity. Amy rushed between appointments, her face flushed but smiling. The show of solidarity warmed Lila's heart, easing some of the tension from the previous night. Officer Daniels arrived just before lunch, his expression grim. Phelps is moving fast, he explained in Lila's office. His lawyers are trying to discredit the worker's testimony and get the petition thrown out on technical grounds. Joe, who had stopped by to check on Rosie, leaned against the wall. If we wait for the legal system, Phelps will destroy everything. We need to act now. He pulled out his phone. What if we share what we have? The shed photos, Rosie's records, everything. Lila chewed her lip. Could that hurt our case? Not if we stick to the facts, Joe insisted. The advocacy group has a strong social media presence. They could help us reach the right people. After careful consideration, Lila nodded. They spent the next hour organizing their evidence, making sure to remove any identifying information about the worker. The advocacy group helped craft a compelling post, sharing it across multiple platforms. The response was immediate. Within hours, the post had thousands of shares. State-level organizations began reaching out, requesting more information. Phelps' retaliation came swiftly. He released a statement calling Lila's evidence manufactured and threatening legal action. Several local businesses pulled their support, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Max visited the clinic that afternoon, clutching a carefully written letter. "I wrote to the mayor," he announced proudly, showing Lila the neat handwriting. "I told him about Hope and how you helped her and Rosie. I said good people help animals, and our town should be good." That evening, as Lila finished her last appointment, her phone rang. The caller identified herself as Sarah Martinez from the National Animal Protection Alliance. "We've seen your evidence, Dr. Moore," Sarah said. "Our organization wants to help. We can provide legal support and funding to build a proper case against this breeding operation." Lila sank into her chair, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." A week passed like molasses, each day filled with anticipation. Officer Daniels, now backed by the National Animal Protection Alliance's resources and evidence, led a team of officers toward Phelps's main property. At the clinic, Lila paced between kennels while Joe sat quietly in a chair, both waiting for news. "They should have started by now," Lila said, checking her phone for the 100th time. Joe nodded, his weathered hands clasped together. "Daniels knows what he's doing. This time, Phelps won't slip away." The raid revealed more than anyone expected. Officers discovered a hidden basement entrance behind heavy storage shelves. Inside, they found dozens of malnourished dogs in cramped cages. Detailed breeding logs and financial records littered a makeshift office, providing irrefutable evidence of Phelps' involvement in illegal breeding operations. When Daniels placed the handcuffs on Phelps' wrists, the man's usual arrogance crumbled. News of his arrest spread through the small town like wildfire. Lila's phone rang just after noon. Her hands trembled as she answered. "We got him, Dr. Moore," Daniels said. "Found everything we needed and more. He's not walking away from this one." Tears streamed down Lila's face as she shared the news with Joe. Max burst through the clinic door moments later, having heard the news from his grandparents. "Is it true?" Max asked, his eyes wide with hope. "Did they really arrest the bad man?" Lila nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes, they did." "So Rosie and Hope are safe now?" Max looked from Lila to Joe. "Forever?" "They're safe," Lila assured him, pulling him into a hug. "And not just them. This means all the other dogs are safe, too. No more will get hurt like Rosie did." That evening, Lila closed the clinic early. She drove with Max to Joe's farm, where they had set up a special area for Rosie and her puppies to play. The setting sun painted the sky in warm colors as they watched Rosie bound through the grass, her puppies tumbling after her. Max sat cross-legged in the grass, Hope cradled in his arms. "I promise I'll always take care of you," he whispered to the puppy, who responded with a tiny lick to his chin. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Lila hung a new sign outside her expanded clinic. Moore Animal Hospital and Rescue Center gleamed in fresh paint, a testament to how much had changed in the months since Phelps' arrest. The small town had transformed too, with new animal welfare regulations and community support programs springing up like wildflowers after rain. Inside the clinic's newly renovated waiting room, a wall displayed Rosie's story. Photos showed her journey from a frightened, injured dog to the happy mother she became. Visitors often paused there, reading about how one brave dog had helped expose an illegal breeding operation and brought a community together. The grant from the National Animal Protection Alliance had allowed Lila to hire 2 more veterinarians and create a proper surgical suite. She smiled as she walked through the clinic, remembering those first difficult days when she'd slept on a cot in her office. At Joe's farm, Rosie had claimed the barn as her domain. She spent her days watching over her grown puppies, who now bounded through the fields with the energy of young dogs who had never known cruelty. The scars of her past had faded, though they'd never completely disappear. Max visited almost daily, proudly leading Hope around the farm. The puppy's hydrocephalus hadn't stopped her from living a full life, thanks to proper medical care and Max's devoted attention. His fear of dogs was now such a distant memory that other children often came to him for advice about handling their own pets. Lila found herself becoming part of an unexpected family. Sunday dinners at Max's grandparents' house became a tradition, with Joe joining them more often than not. The quiet farmer had opened up over the months, revealing a gentle wisdom that complemented Lila's determination. One sunny afternoon, Lila drove out to Joe's farm. The scene before her brought warmth to her heart. Rosie and her puppies romped through the tall grass, while Max ran ahead of Hope, who followed him with playful barks. Her gait was slightly unsteady, but her joy was unmistakable. Joe sat on the porch, 2 cups of tea waiting on the small table beside him. Lila joined him, settling into the familiar wooden chair. They watched the happy chaos in comfortable silence until Lila spoke softly. "We all needed saving, didn't we?" If you enjoyed the story of Rosie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.